So contracts for projects they're complicated. They're related to delivery method of the project. That's probably the starting point of a conversation like this. And projects here, there's many ways that you can deliver a project, but there's sort of three major ways that we see, at least here in Arizona. There's the old-fashioned way, which is called a design, bid, build delivery method. And that is where an owner will hire an architect, and they may hire them in a variety of ways. I'll talk about that in a minute, but they're going to hire an architect. The architect is then going to design the project, working with the owner, but only the owner. Then when it's done, they will take that project and put it out to bid publicly. They'll basically go out and say, I have this project. Any contractor out there is welcome to come bid on this project, and whoever is the lowest bidder will be awarded that project. That's the oldest method, and not one that we see as often these days. There is a subset of that. It's not one of the three I was mentioning earlier, but a subset of that is what would be called a qualified low bid. And a qualified low bid is where you would say, same basic structure, you design it first, and then you put it out to bid. But at least in the case of a qualified low bid, the owner will pre-qualify the contractors that are allowed to bid. And what that basically means is they're still going to, in most cases, take the low bidder, but they will know that the contractor has the capacity to deliver on the project based on past experience. In the case of a low bid, and the reason that this isn't used that much anymore, you kind of get what you get. I mean, if you put something out to bid and someone comes in that doesn't know what they're doing and dramatically underbids a project, you could be in a scenario where you're working with a very difficult contractor because they haven't accounted for all the complexities in the project. And in our work, where we're trying to do high design and often we'll have unique details and that sort of thing, the low bid environment doesn't work that well. And so that's our least preferred way of procuring a project. The two ways that we see a lot more often now, the most common way here in Arizona is called CM at risk, or construction manager at risk. This is a methodology where the owner will select an architect and a contractor at roughly the same time. It might be a month apart, a few weeks apart, but the idea is that they will select and hire a contractor at roughly the same time as the designer, and then we work with them hand in hand throughout the design process, so that when we get to the end of the design phase, we already know who the contractor is. They're going to put together what's called a GMP, or a guaranteed maximum price, and so they will have been working with us each step along the way, and they're going to get to a point where they are now going to put together their numbers, and they'll still bid out some of the subcontract work. So most contractors aren't going to do the electrical or the mechanical or the steel work or things like that. So they'll bid out those scopes, but they'll be writing a scope of work that subcontractors will bid on, but they still have general knowledge and control of the project throughout that process. And that's a process that we found generally works pretty well, particularly if it's a sophisticated, experienced contractor with CM at risk, because they understand how the decisions that need to be made in giving good feedback about the design process. And what we also really like about that is early on in the design, we're having a dialogue with the contractor. They're helping us with constructability questions, they're helping us with budgetary questions, so that by the time we get to the GMP phase, we know that the project's going to be generally in budget. You sort of eliminate the surprises of finding out that you're 30% over budget and then have to redraw the project or something like that, which is less than ideal. The other somewhat newer. It's not new across the world, but it's somewhat newer in this area, is what's called DesignBuild. Going back for a second to CM at risk. In a CM at risk environment, you have an owner, and the owner has a contract with the contractor, the construction manager, and they have a contract with the architect. So each of us are contracted to the owner, but we work together closely. In a design-build environment, generally there's only one contract. The architect and the contractor become a team, so we will join up at the start of a project and we'll pursue that project together as a team. And if our team is selected, the owner will have one contract with the design builder, that being the contractor and the architect. We develop the project together along with the owner, and then at the end deliver the project. And so you're responsible in that case from the very beginning to deliver a project for usually a certain budget. In our experience, we've done projects that are what they call a firm fixed price project up front, and what that means is you have a set budget that we are responsible to design within that budget, and the contractor has to build the project within that budget. And so what's good for the owner is they know pretty much exactly what they're going to get up front. I mean, there's certain aspects of design build that can be a challenge if you have market volatility or things like that. Sometimes you can get into a little bit of a corner from a budgetary perspective, but it generally works fairly well. Now, the owner doesn't necessarily have the alleged benefit of the low bid environment, where they could perhaps get a project for less than the amount they contract for up front. But conversely, they know they have at least a qualified team that's doing that project. And so in the end, I think they get a better product that way. And so Jones Studio has had success and likes to work both in the CM at risk environment and the design build environment much more than the low bid environment, because we believe that we have better quality control and generally a higher outcome and result for the project. Now, for contracts relative to the architect, you can imagine, given these different methods, the way we execute our contract varies somewhat. The most common kind of contract that's used is the AIA, American Institute of Architects contract. And there's a construction contract they have, there's a designer's contract they have, and they have variations depending on the method that you're using. But a lot of clients like to use the AIA contract because it is set up it's a very fair and reasonable contract that takes into account the needs of all the parties, the owner, the contractor, the architect, etc. Some entities, particularly larger ones, will, if they're big enough, they might have their own contract structure. The federal government has their own contracts. Some large universities have their own contracts. And they're able to do that because they're big enough to have a legal team to develop those contracts. And so when we pursue a project, we're generally aware of the type of contract structure that project's going to have. For private clients, for houses, things like that, we would generally use an AIA contract because they're not going to want to develop their own contract for a single project or something like that. In a design build environment, again, the prime contract is going between the owner and the contractor. And then there's a secondary contract within our team between the contractor and the architect. In a CM at risk environment, there's a contractor contract and there's an architectural or design team contract. And the design team can be called that. It can be the design team. It can be the design professional. It varies again depending on the language and who the owner is and that sort of thing. Generally, the architect is, within the design realm, the architect is the prime, and then we have a series of sub-consultants that we work with. The primary consultants we work with are civil engineers, landscape engineers, mechanical, electrical, plumbing engineers, structural engineers. Those are sort of the real basic consultants that we would have on just about any project. And then you have what's called specialty consultants. You might have an acoustician, you might have a technology consultant, you might have an audiovisual consultant. Depending on the type of project, if it's very specific, you might have a laboratory consultant or a theater consultant or things like that. And so then you have subcontracts between the architect and each of these individual team members. And contract language obviously shifts from being sort of the architectural and business domain to being sort of a legal domain. And so language in developing contracts is complicated, and that's one of the reasons that we often like to use AIA contracts, because they're already developed, they've already been vetted, and we as in the design community, the design AEC, architectural, engineering, construction industry recognizes that these contracts have been developed and they're generally fair and that sort of thing. So going back to the procurement that we talked about a little bit earlier, when we are being selected, there were times, decades ago, when architectural services were procured by a low bid or low fee type of environment. That's very rare today. There are still some private clients that want to select based on fee. We generally don't pursue projects or clients that way, because we tend to find when we're focused on design, we would like our qualifications to be the reason that someone selects us, and then we'll have a negotiation and come up with a fair fee to select that. When you are working with someone that is exclusively interested in the lowest fee possible, odds are they're less interested in quality design. And since that's what we are ultimately after, is trying to develop a high quality project that's going to benefit the community, we tend to focus on projects that are delivered in that way.